The air inside the Global Futures Forum in Geneva vibrated with a kind of humming tension that didn't need words to be understood, the kind that came when hundreds of minds of students, diplomats, activists, policymakers, scientists gathered under one roof carrying decades of frustration, urgent fears, and fragile hopes, all waiting to hear what might finally break the cycle of promises unmet. And as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. stepped onto the stage, shoulders heavy from travel and the weight of expectation, no one anticipated that the moment he opened his mouth would ignite a storm that would reshape the entire tone of the conference, because before he could even complete his second sentence he asked something about the crossroads humanity faced. A sharp, unmistakable voice rose from halfway down the audience, cutting clean through the polite silence like a blade slicing fabric, and Greta Thunberg, young yet carved by years of activism into someone far older than her age suggested, stood with trembling hands and a fire burning behind her eyes as she demanded, "Are we really still pretending that urgency can wait for one more speech?" A question that sent a collective jolt across the auditorium, where gasps rippled in waves from the front rows to the back. Journalists jerked their heads up, students froze, and even the moderator's practice calm evaporated into startled disbelief, for it wasn't merely an interruption, it was a call-out, a public challenge delivered with the kind of raw emotion that comes only after seeing too many promises eroded over time, and as her voice echoed against the high curved ceiling, Kennedy paused, visibly inhaling the gravity of what had just happened, but instead of reacting with irritation, defensiveness, or the polished political composure many had expected, he stepped away from the podium as though shedding a protective shell, his eyes settling on Greta with a steady warmth that seemed to quiet the air around him, and in a voice softer than anyone anticipated, he said, "Greta, you're right to interrupt me." The audience froze as though time itself had stopped, because they had come prepared for debate, disagreement, perhaps even hostility, but not for humility. Not for a public figure dismantling his own authority with one honest admission, and Kennedy continued, each word carrying a weight that pressed into the room. "Your generation has waited for hours to act. We didn't move fast enough, and if you interrupt because you're tired of waiting, then maybe that interruption is exactly what we need to hear." A statement that shifted the entire atmosphere from conflict to confrontation of truth, causing Greta's expression a firm, determined, but lined with exhaustion to soften just slightly, though she did not sit down. Instead, Kennedy gestured gently toward the stage, saying, "If you believe my speech isn't urgent enough, come up here. Say what needs to be said. Speak, not from the outside but from right here." And though some gasped again, perhaps expecting her to refuse or recoil, Greta stepped forward without hesitation, weaving through rows of uncertain onlookers to take her place beside the podium, her footsteps echoing like punctuation marks on the polished floor. When she reached him, Kennedy moved aside, not backward, not in retreat, but in a deliberate gesture of shared space, an unspoken acknowledgement that leadership could be expanded rather than guarded, and with one steadying inhale, Greta faced the crowd, her voice trembling not with fear but with the weight of urgency she had carried for years. "I interrupt because I'm scared not of him, not of governments, but of what will happen if we continue pretending that change begins tomorrow. Tomorrow is too late. It always has been." And as her words sank deeper into the collective heart of the room, the tension that once separated generations, ideologies, and political expectations began to dissolve into something more human, more vulnerable, more necessary. What started as an interruption evolved into an improvised dialogue between Greta and Kennedy, an exchange that felt less like confrontation and more like an intergenerational reckoning, with Greta pressing relentlessly for clarity, demanding timelines, accountability, actual steps rather than lofty pledges, while Kennedy responded candidly, shedding the protective armor of political rhetoric as he admitted mistakes, acknowledged the failures of older generations, and emphasized that solutions required not only urgency but unity. And as they spoke, the room's energy transformed. Activists who had arrived ready to protest softened with cautious hope, students who feared they were inheriting a dying planet leaned forward with renewed curiosity, diplomats who had mastered neutrality allowed genuine emotion to surface, and even the journalists, usually hungry for angles of conflict, lowered their cameras just slightly, realizing they were witnessing something unprecedented: two powerful voices, one youthful and fiery, the other seasoned and reflective, colliding not to shatter but to merge into something stronger. Greta then raised the final challenge, voice resonating through the chandelier-lit chamber: "If we leave today inspired but unchanged, then today is wasted." Let this moment be the one where we stop measuring who cares more and start proving it together. And the stillness afterward was so complete it felt as though even the air had paused to absorb her plea. Kennedy placed a hand over his heart, a gesture not of surrender but of sincere commitment, and said, "Starting tomorrow, I want you on the task force shaping the Youth Climate Initiative." Not as a symbolic voice, not as a token presence, but as a leader. A promise that triggered an eruption of applause so full and fierce that it shook the walls, a release of emotion that felt like relief after years of pent-up frustration. When the forum concluded hours later and people began to drift out beneath the soft Geneva twilight, no one walked with the hurried energy typical of conferences where speeches blur together. Instead, they moved slowly, quietly, thoughtfully, carrying with them the realization that progress doesn't always emerge from perfect cooperation but often from disruption, vulnerability, and the willingness of leaders to listen when it matters most. Greta and Kennedy exited the building side by side, still talking, still debating, still searching for solutions. And while no single conversation could heal decades of environmental damage or political stagnation, the sight of them walking together, a symbol of generational continuity rather than division, sparked something rare and precious in the minds of all who witnessed it: the belief that hope, however fragile, remained possible. And in the whispers that drifted through the departing crowd, whispers from young activists inspired to speak louder, from older policymakers motivated to rethink assumptions, from everyday attendees who felt as though they had glimpsed a turning point. The one sentiment echoed most clearly, spoken softly by a woman clutching her notebook against her chest: "Maybe this is what change actually looks like, a broken bar, not polished, not peaceful, but possible." And as the final lights dimmed inside the grand hall, the moment left behind a quiet truth that would ripple far beyond the forum's walls: that sometimes the most powerful breakthroughs arise not when voices compete to drown one another out, but when courage meets humility, when urgency meets responsibility, and when generations choose to build bridges rather than walls, proving that even in a world tired of broken promises, hope can still be born from the boldness of interrupting and the grace of listening.